Greetings to our beloved AME Zion Church family. Grace and peace to you from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ, in whom we live, we move, and we have our being. Let me begin my brief remarks by congratulating Sister Linda Padaway and the members of the John Wesley AME Zion Church Women's Home and Overseas Missionary Society, along with their wonderful pastor, the Reverend Dr. Christopher Zacharias, and beautiful First Lady Kim Zacharias, for calling us together both on Saturday in Washington, D.C., and again this evening on this virtual platform for a truly sacred purpose. I also want to express my appreciation to Mr. Darren Kent, who we affectionately just call DK, and Reverend Sam Brown for the exciting and informative new programs they presented through the Star of Zion live event. This evening is a time of commemoration, conversation, and celebration. 142 years ago, the Women's Home and Overseas Missionary Society was born. It was officially established by the AME Zion General Conference of 1880, and Mrs. Mary Talbert Jones was selected as the first president. She was a courageous advocate for justice and freedom. Her pursuit of educational excellence and the advancement of Black women still inspire the women of Zion today. She worked tirelessly at her husband's side, Bishop Singleton Jones, to fight against the lingering efforts of slavery and to uplift the educational and quality of life for African Americans. They were committed to evangelism through spreading the gospel and expanding the borders of the AME Zion Church. So yes, we gather this evening to commemorate. However, some truly gifted women have been invited to join in a panel conversation. It promises to be both insightful and inspirational. I encourage you to listen to the enormous wisdom that will be shared by these amazing women and contribute your comments as well. And finally, this evening is a special time of commemoration, of conversation, but also one of the celebrations as we celebrate 142 years of mission through the Women's Home and Overseas Missionary Society of our beloved Zion. Let us all recommit ourselves, like President Mary Talbert Jones, to the service of uplifting our people and to sharing the good news of the love of Christ for all. So on behalf of the Mid-Atlantic Episcopal District, Presiding Bishop W. Darren Moore, and all of our missionaries on every level, I am honored to extend a warm welcome to you. Our challenge, our calling, and our commitment remain the same when asked how to reach the masses, men of every birth. For an answer, Jesus gave the key. And I, if I be lifted up from the earth, will draw all men unto me. Lift him up, lift him up. Still, he speaks from eternity. And if I be lifted up from the earth, will draw all men unto me.
Mute. Mama Kennard, you have to come off mute.
Thank you.
Do it once again. You got to come off mute.
Thank you. On behalf of the parent body missionaries of John Wesley AME Zion Church, I would like to again welcome you on behalf of our president, Mrs. Linda Roseman Pettaway, and Dr. Christopher L. Zacharias, our pastor. This is the culminary historic event representing a weekend of celebrating the 142nd anniversary of the Women's Home and Overseas Missionary Society of the AME Zion Church. This evening, we will discuss our chosen theme, Mary Jane Talbot Jones, the wife, the mother, and the leader. Our panelists have distinguished themselves through service, mission, and outreach, and they follow in the footsteps of our first president, Mary Jane Talbot Jones. First, we have Mrs. Sandra Crowder, the international president of the Women's Home and Overseas Missionary Society of the AME Zion Church. Next, Mrs. Angela Davis Baxter, international first vice president of the Women's Home and Overseas Missionary Society of the AME Zion Church. Mrs. Wilhelmina Frazier, president of the Washington District Women's Home and Overseas Missionary Society of the AME Zion Church. And Mrs. Maddie Taylor, editor, Good News Newsletter, Women's Home and Overseas Missionary Society of the AME Zion Church. And of course, I am Marjorie Kennard, your moderator, and I am a member of the parent body of John Wesley AME Zion Church and the president of the Philadelphia-Baltimore Conference, Ministers, Spouses, and Widowers Fellowship for the AME Zion Church. Again, our chosen theme for this anniversary celebration is Mary Talbot Jones, the wife, the mother, and the leader. We're going to get right on into our discussion now because we want to look at it. DK, you can move that if you want to because we're ready to get busy. We want to take some privileges here, if you don't mind, members of our audience, because there's not that much written about Mary Jane Talbot Jones, just a few things, but we want to have some license, if you will, to let our imaginations run with us as we discuss this wonderful woman. Now let's take a look at the life of Mary Talbot Jones. At 15 years old, what made Mary Jane Talbot Jones prepared for marriage? Because we know that she got married at 15 years old. Let's open our discussion by this fact. Was she ready? And when you think about girls today, are they ready to get married at 15? What made it different in those days for her to perhaps be ready for marriage at 15 years old?
15 today. Go ahead.
As I began thinking about that question, I think that Mary Talbot Jones probably had some strong mentors when it comes to her family and her mother and her grandmother, and watching those women in the home and in their marriages, because that it wasn't something that women were formally taught. it was modeled for them. And I really believe that in her home that she had some examples of a very good, strong family, and also a husband-wife relationship. Because history tells us that Mary Jane Talbert Jones was an exceptional helpmeet. And so I think she had some strong modeling and examples to follow.
Well, how were girls raised in those days differently from how they are raised today? Does anybody want to talk about that?
In those days, I think that girls matured earlier. It was not so much out of the ordinary that someone would marry at the age of 15. And I think that Mary Jones could have been really mature even for her age, because I read that she gave her life to Christ at the age of 12. So she, and like Sandra said, others modeled their life. And so I think that girls then were a little bit more mature, and they were ready to have families, and large families.
But what about her education?
I also feel that, to piggyback on what the president has just said and what Mrs. Taylor said, during those days, girls got married at an earlier age than now. And as she stated, girls were more mature because in the home, like she said, women were expected to be able to do certain things. A lot of times they had to help care for their siblings and so forth. So I think that during those days, women got married at an earlier age than they do in today's society.
But was she educationally prepared at 15? I mean, how much could she know? How do you think the schools were in those days? Was she prepared educationally?
She probably learned mainly from her home, from her parents. Were very had a large influence on her abilities and what she learned throughout. We're talking about the 1800s, and during that time, a lot of African Americans, as we know, we learned from inside the home during that time. So during that time period, I would say that she learned all of her needs from there. I'm not saying that she did not receive any schooling, because we know that she was an intelligent woman. So, but she learned a lot from inside of the home. So at age 15, based on that time, when we're looking at that time period, she probably had enough education to go on to be a good wife, a good mother, because that's what she learned in the household at the time, watching her parents rear her along with her siblings.
What do you imagine to be some of the things she may have learned in the home that girls perhaps today don't learn? I remember years ago, there were quilting and cooking and what other kinds of things. Somebody said taking care of little children. Can you think of some other things that may have prepared her to be a wife or a mother at an early age?
Well, I think one of the things probably was very important then was etiquette. Girls were taught etiquette for the home and also for church as well. And I really think that she was taught how to be a lady, because when we read the history, it says that Mary Talbert Jones was a person of great hospitality because her parents would always receive visitors into the home. It was something sort of like we would say today, like if you stopped at like an Airbnb or something. We know they didn't have hotels then. And so when ministers would travel, they would stop to stay in the home of Mary Jane Talbert Jones's parents. And so she was taught to be very hospitable. And so that just carried over into her leadership and her being able to associate with probably people of great prominence, because we can assume that there were probably preachers that came by, church leaders, because we know that they didn't have just anyone coming into their home. And so I think this was something that may have impacted her in a great way.
Well, how do you think she met Reverend Singleton Jones? He was 21 years old when they met. She was 15, he was 21. That's a 6-year difference, I guess, in age. So he wasn't that much older than she, but he was a grown man. Maybe she was considered a grown woman at 15 back in those days. I don't know, because they were both from Pennsylvania. And in those days, I guess people looked at courtship a little differently. But how do you imagine they could have met?
Imagine it could have been a setup, the parents or somebody could have, they knew that this young good young fellow who's going to be a preacher needed a good woman, and then there she was. And she had all those graces that up and coming young man needed. And in addition to that, the question was asked, how did they meet when they lived 200 and some miles away? But they met through church, like we meet through church, I would think, because at that time, we didn't have a lot of conferences, but it was in Pennsylvania. And when they went to the annual conference or whatever, he was there, she was there. I understand if he could play the piano, maybe she could sing, and they got together in those type of ways. And she was it seems as if she was a very good looking young lady. And I guess with his pictures, he didn't look too bad. So they could have gotten together that way.
And then too, I think they probably thought he was going places, because if you remember, he was a poet.
Mm-hmm.
He had so many things going for him. He could play the organ. Then he had been an apprentice to be an attorney, working with an attorney. So he had a lot going for him. So I guess her parents and other people in the community probably thought he was a catch, wouldn't you say? Okay, well now, why do you think she chose him, or did he choose her? They say that the man chooses the woman, but sometimes the woman chooses the man. So who do you think chose, how did they make that decision that was it?
Well, I would sort of piggyback on what Mrs. Taylor said, that my imagination would say to me that they met at church. And we know how it is when young people go to church, that there are always those young people that kind of stand out. And we know it says that Singleton Jones was a great orator, that, he was very eloquent when he spoke, that he wrote songs, and that he could sing, and that he could play. And so I'm sure here is this young lady who is at church, and we would probably assume that Mary Talbert Jones too was very active when she was at church, because of that leadership that we know that sprung forth from her. And so the two of them probably, just as Mrs. Taylor said, that they just kind of connected. And so I don't know which one may have made the first, what we would say today, the first move, but they probably were both eyeing each other.
I think so too.
Yeah. Well, now when they got married, when she married him at 15, he was 21. He had just gotten his preacher's license. So that means that they started out together. He wasn't a pastor, say, for a number of years. So they started out together. So she kind of helped him become who he was in ministry and pastoring. And I just imagine that the people loved them both. They did go around, have several churches, and of course they even pastored down here in the Washington area. But the interesting things is they had 12 children. How could she have 12 children, be a pastor's wife, and work in the church? What do you think were some of the things driving her there?
I think that was expected of the women through the time. I was looking at, I looked up to see about how many children that the average family had in the 1850s. And they said the average number of children was from 6 to 9. And these families, sometimes for economic reasons, to help out with the in the family. And then later on, these children would take care of their parents. So having 12 children was not all that different in those days. And when I read someplace that some of her children, about 4 of her children, died in infancy. And she did have a set of twins. And the baby who became the bishop was not born until 1871. So that was way, the father was already a bishop by the time he was born. So
that's right.
But that's what you did.
Well, I think Singleton Jones he was in line to become a bishop, wouldn't you say? Because it didn't take him long to become a bishop. It took him about 17 years, I think. And generally it takes at least 20, but I guess those standards that we have now were different from the standards they had years ago as far as becoming a bishop in the AME Zion Church.
And they probably didn't have a lot of ministers either back in those days. And
well, the history says that in 1880 at that general conference when the society was formed, is that there were only 6 bishops in the AME Zion Church during that time. And so there were not a lot of bishops. And we know that, they were planting churches at that time. So there weren't a whole lot of churches either.
That's right. That's right. Well, we do know that they did a lot. I like to say civil rights, but of course they didn't call it civil rights in those days. But they certainly did a lot to uplift our people. And even though they were freed, the slaves were freed, I guess, by the time they got to Pennsylvania, but they still did not live in the best situations. So we find that Singleton Jones and his wife, Mary Jane Talbert Jones, they did a lot to help the uplift of our people, as did other educated and leaders in the Black community back in those days. They didn't just sit around. They really did a lot to help. And I was just so pleased to see that was part of what was going on. Let's talk about her.
Based on what you just said, I was thinking, since we were talking about this, I was thinking the other day, it's ironic that our theme for this, these years for this quadrennial has been the Global Commission # Missions Matter. And the first component was social justice. And it's ironic that during that time, Mary Talbot Jones was working even then on social justice because she was working towards the abolition, and as she was an abolitionist and trying to transform lives. That's also a part of our component, that she transformed lives through the work that she did in helping others to have a better life for freedom.
Absolutely. And it's in our bones. It's
Yes.
in the bones of the Women's Home and Overseas Missionary Society that we do this. So we're for social justice, definitely. I'm glad you brought that point out, and I appreciate that. Now let's talk about her leadership skills. Now, I guess, well, I've been, my husband wasn't a full pastor. He was always an assistant. But I've been around and I've seen pastors and pastors' wives enough to know that some have a lot of leadership skills. I'm talking about the wives now, and some don't. But she definitely had leadership skills. How do you think she honed those skills? She didn't have the education that the women have now, but she was dynamic. The people loved her. She fought for social justice. How do you think she got those skills and had the feeling she had for benevolency?
What's up?
Well, I don't know whether this had anything to do with it, but I would imagine if you have 15 children or 12 children, that would help you to become an organizer and have leadership skills, because you have to learn how to manage with children, with that many children. And it also helped you as far as communicating with others, especially, since they were in the church. But I also feel that in order to manage a family or to develop leadership skills, it starts at home. And with 15 children, you had to have some sort of leadership skill and organizational skills to run the home.
Yes. Now that brings us up to when she was beginning to be the president in 1880. I'm thinking, my imagination tells me that she was working with women along these lines well before it was brought to the General Conference. What do you think about that? Do you think that this organization just popped out of the clear blue sky, or were there some precursors to the Women's Home and Overseas Missionary Society?
Well, I would say that the first precursor would be going all the way back to Harriet Tubman, because, the history of Mary Jones and her husband says that they kind of modeled themselves after her in the work that she did with the freeing of slaves. And so that was just such a strong example there. And then the many other organizations that we know that came before that were working, such as the Daughters of the Conference, that came out of the Mother AME Zion Church in New York, where those ladies were organized and they were working in Zion, and the Mite Society, where the women were working for the children and the orphans. And so the women in Zion had already started to do missions, but they weren't calling it, they were calling it missions, but they weren't doing it as an organized body. And so the work was already going on.
I agree with President Crowder in the fact that she mentioned the Daughters of Conference, which started back in 1821, and their purpose was to raise money for the ministers. Ministers back then, a lot of them got no salary, and they raised money because we were expanding in the South. So they raised money for our churches in the South and all of those things. And we had Eliza Ann Gardner and all of the other women, plus the fact that we had the Reverend Andrew Cartwright, our first missionary to Africa, there in 1878, and started the work in Monrovia, Liberia, West Africa. And the women raised money to send him. Bishop Walls in his history said, the church saw how the women were working and decided to organize. I like to think that the women, because they couldn't be delegates at the General Conference at that time, they probably went to Marbell and others and said, submit a resolution. It's time, we want to organize. And so some men understood and knew, and that it's the women who raise the money, as it is now, and that's how they got to be organized.
You give a task to a woman, no matter what.
Mhm.
She's going to add to it. It's not going to be peasy. She can take a germ and make something out of it. And I think that's what she did.
Yeah.
I was challenged to do something, probably had an idea, was challenged to do it, and it just blew their minds when it came to the General Conference in 1880. Did anyone else want to say something about that before we move on? All right, now, why do you think she was chosen the first president? Sometimes we say the founding president, but certainly the first president of the Missionary Society.
Well, I would say that she probably was chosen because she, as we said, she was already leading the women at that time. And so we know that her husband, Bishop Singleton Jones, was then serving as, I think he was like the chairman of the board of Home and Foreign Missions. And then Reverend Mark Bell, who presented the resolution, was the secretary of the board of Home and Foreign Missions. And so who else but the wife of the chairman of the board of Home and Foreign Missions to serve as the president, since she was already doing the work. So I think it was not just what we would say, it was just a given that she would do it, but she had already proved herself that she was the woman to, if we were going to have an organization that would take the organization and take it to a level that where we are today.
Good, good. Anybody else want to say something on that? Because we know that she was 49 years old when she became president of the society, and she held that for 15 years. So let's talk about some of the things she was able to achieve in those 15 years.
I would say that we know that she had a lot of difficulties, though. Before we get to what she accomplished, she faced a lot of challenges with raising funds and faced with organizing the society. Don't we know that? But she kept working hard and tirelessly to make sure that it came forward with the Women's Home and Overseas Missionary Society, because we can see that as in today, how women struggle to get different positions, whether it's in the church, in the political arena, and how sometimes men will put stumbling blocks in the way. And history talks about that, how she faced that within the AME Zion Church back in 1880. And you talked earlier how women did not have a voice. And it showed when she went to the General Conference to give her report. She talked about it, but then she was faced with different obstacles to get there. So that was a challenge that she faced to be successful as a president. She didn't allow anything to stop her from moving forward, but despite the things that she went through. So I would say there was an obstacle and an accomplishment that she never gave up. She kept pushing. So we are where we are today, 142 years later.
That's right. It was not a bed of roses for her as the first president. Now let's bring things to today, in today's time, the growth that has taken place within the Women's Home and Overseas Missionary Society. Where are we now as opposed to where we were during her day? Can you speak to that, anybody? Who wants to take that on first?
Well, I would say during her that there was only one body, the parent body, you might want to say, and as a result of her leadership and her vision, we now have 6 departments. today. So, I mean, it has that because of her vision and the work that she did. And I'm sure even then there were older women, there were younger women who that she involved. They just were not, they had not said, they were not organized as various departments.
Mm-hmm. Do you think the overseas component is more active now than it was back in her day? I know she did a lot overseas, but I'm thinking that maybe we have done much more. What are your thoughts?
Well, I wouldn't say that. Well, we would say yes, more, because we are larger now.
Mm-hmm.
But the interest in of the AME Zion Church then was really growing in Africa. And if we were to trace that, then we could see how we have grown, and the number of countries where we're located now in Africa, which also have the Women's Home and Overseas Missionary Society. We know that now presently, in our overseas work, particularly in Africa, we have more members of the Women's Home and Overseas Missionary Society than we do here in the United States. And as we watch their work and observe their work, they're doing phenomenal things over there in their ministries. And so it was a time where we were going there to do missions and to minister to them, but now they're ready to come here and help minister to us.
That's beautiful. It's wonderful to be able to go to the convention and see women from Africa and other countries in the sessions. And it really allows us to see how international we really are. And it's a wonderful thing. I don't know, what time is it now? Are we nearing our time? I don't have a watch near me.
7:38.
7:38.
Mhm.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, we have much more time. We can keep talking. Well, now let's talk about some of the various departments that we have now that we didn't have back there.
The first department that was organized after the Parent Society was in 1904. By that time, Mary Jones was dead because she died in 1895. Mm-hmm. The women knew that if the society was going to go on and increase, we had to organize our children. And so we organized in 1904 the Buds of Promise with Marie L. Clinton. And from there we organized, that was in 1904, the 1912, at the 1912 General Conference, we accepted the youth, the wise, and also the supply was accepted at that time. And we've gone on. I think the Life Members started in 1916, but it ended a year later. But then came back 17 years later, 1935, and the Life Members Council is the largest of our departments. And so we've grown. And then, of course, the baby, which is the Young Adult Missionary Society, the YAMS, Dr. Willa Mae Rice's idea, and something that Dr. Adlise Porter just ran with it. And so I was never a YAM. By the time they started, I was too old. You know?
Mrs. Taylor.
But anyway, I have peach and dope.
Yeah, honorary YAM.
Mrs. Taylor, I have to say something about the Young Adult Missionary Society, having served as the third general coordinator, that when I think about the YAMS, I think about Dr. Willa Mae Rice, I think about the spirit of Mary Talbert Jones, because it was such a fight, and they had to persevere to get the resolution passed for the Young Adult Missionary Society. You know, they took that resolution to the convention in 1975, and they started working on it then. And it wasn't until 1983 until the idea was accepted and it was passed. And so just that spirit of perseverance and to continue to work for something that we knew that the Women's Home and Overseas Missionary Society needed was to involve our young adults. It just says that they carried on the spirit of Mary Jane Talbert Jones.
What do you see as the Women's Home and Overseas Missionary Society's greatest challenge today? Now, I know that's a heavy question, but do you think we're just sailing on smoothly, everything is fine and hokey dokey, as they say, or is there something that we need to improve upon? What do you think?
I would say that maybe not so much a challenge for the missionary, well, a challenge for the missionaries and the whole AME Zion Church is to continue to get the young adults and the youth really involved into the church. Not too from the young adults. I'm just trying to make myself look young. Thank you. Not too much from the young adult age. I would say that that's one thing that all departments, including the Women's Home and Overseas Missionary Society, is to continue to embrace and the youth and young adults, because they do have new visions, new ideas, and we should be willing to embrace those and take those on, because the way that we may have done things are differently, in the way that we do things they're not interested in doing. And so we have to learn to work together as a intergenerational body to incorporate all types of things inside the missionary society, in order that we may have the input and the participation of everyone throughout Zion, not just parent body, but from parent body to the BUDS department. We need to be willing to embrace that, to embrace change. Change is always a hard thing, and no matter where you come from. And I would just say this, because we're in this meeting, we're just having a discussion. One thing I would say about the international president is she allows the diversity to come through the executive board members, the departments, to be able to do different things, to be very inclusive of all ages of the AME Zion Church. So I think that the more that we do that, the more we will see throughout the church that people will embrace our vision to win the world for Christ and begin to participate more with all departments within the AME Zion Church.
Absolutely, absolutely.
I also think that in addition to what Mrs. Baxter Davis has said, is that we need to continue to educate, because many people are in there say, I'm a missionary, but then like with us on the Washington district this year, I decided to do a segment at our mass meetings on Know Your Society. And some people have been in the society for a long time and they still don't know everything that there is, the purpose, the goals, what we're supposed to do. So I also feel that education is also needs to continue, not only in the missionary society, but many of our other lay people need to know more about the society, because the way it is now, everybody's doing their own little thing and we're not working together, and we're supposed to be working towards one goal, and that is to make disciples and win the world for Christ. And that should be each department, whether it's missionaries, whether it's Christian education, whether it's lay council. I think that we still, in addition to what, like I said, Mrs. Baxter has said, we still need to somehow educate in innovative ways. It might be through technology. Like she said, there are many ways that we can get the word out.
Good. Any other comments about that? Do we do any kind of research or I guess you would say studies to see how we've been effective in the various departments, how we've been effective overall as a society? Have we done anything like that? I see.
Mrs. Kennard, we really have not done any surveys, but that is such a good idea to take back to the executive board, that sometimes we have to really reevaluate what we're doing and how we're doing it. We talk about reflecting on how we do our programs, how we do our ministries. We ask ourselves these very important questions. I know in a workshop that I presented, I have asked participants or our district presidents to go back and look at, reflect on your programs, how you're doing your ministry. Is it effective? Are you meeting the needs in your community, the needs in your area? What's needed? You know, sometimes we get into the habit of just following what was done the year before and the year before that, but we really need to be intentional and purposeful about our ministries and our programming. And so doing a survey would be an excellent thing for us to do. You know, we have our quadrennial convention coming up. And so that might be something that we can also incorporate in that with our delegates, is to take the time to complete a survey for us.
Mm-hmm. What about the historic preservation? Is there any system by which we are keeping the history of the various parent bodies? Does each church maintain the history of its parent body to the extent that they can say, this is when we were organized, these are all of the names of all of our presidents through the years? Is there any thing that will be done probably in the future that will bring together the history of the organization? And I know we already have a history, but I'm talking about a more broad-based something that could be as far as even the parent body contributing their history to a larger source.
I can't really speak for the local church, but I would think that each local society does keep a history, and if not, they should be, and also on the district level as well. In the general society, we do have our history, and we do have a chronological documentation of that and where we've been and where we are now, particularly through historical highlights that was edited by and put together by Mrs. Maddie Taylor, who is one of the panelists tonight. And so at our upcoming quadrennial convention in 23, you will receive a revised edition of an updated edition of historical highlights.
Great. I'll look forward to seeing that.
And maybe that can be, I know that you don't want to add any additional responsibilities, but maybe that could be the task of someone in mission education, as far as in each local church. Maybe that's something, as far as, you know, like, and some churches have archives, mm-hmm. you know, of various things that have happened. So maybe that could be something that each local church, you know, might be able to do. Maybe somehow, I don't know how we would ask them to do it, but maybe that is something that each local church could think about, and, you know, in turn pass it on to the district level.
Yeah.
And then pass that on.
I know we can't solve all of the solutions or come up with solutions here, but I think sometimes it's fun to just think about it. Think about the possibilities of what could happen. As a matter of fact, when I go around to the different churches talking about historic preservation within the churches, getting the church histories together, I say not only find out who all of your pastors were, because they know the names of the pastors, what about the pastors' wives and their children? And find information about each pastor, each pastor's wife, and what their children did, because the children did so many fabulous things through the years. And I think that can increase the self-esteem even of members. And of course, it would increase our self-esteem as a Zion connection. So that's kind of what I'm thinking about, because we need to have even more information about Mary Jane Talbert Jones. We know her mother and father's name. Did she have siblings? And just other bits and pieces of information, so we won't have to imagine. It'll already be written somewhere.
751.
Now,
751.
750. What is that, Maddie?
That's the time. 751.
Oh, Maddie, now see, you throwing me off. I'm saying, well, thank you. Well, where's DK? I know he wanted to
Need the president.
wrap up. Now, Maddie, you saying it's time to wrap up, aren't you?
Mhm. To call our international president to get us.
Oh yeah. Well, now we got to find out where DK is. We gotta come on without the rest of what we have to do. But Sandra, you can go on and do your thing, and hopefully DK, I don't know if he's expecting us. Is he gonna come back at 8 o'clock or what? But if you will wrap up for us, we would certainly appreciate it.
All right, thank you, Mrs. Kennard. But first of all, let's thank the John Wesley AME Zion Church for this phenomenal idea to celebrate the 142nd anniversary by remembering the first president, Mary Talbert Jones. Thank you, John Wesley. But they asked me to wrap up and talk about the society. But I just want to say that after 142 years, the Women's Home and Overseas Missionary has grown from a very small idea to something now that is very phenomenal. We are now a global organization, starting from the old ship AME Zion Church in 1880 to now. We are a strong organization, and all of us, the 17 presidents who have served after Mary Talbot Jones, stand on that firm and strong foundation that she left. I want to say that we have now 117 district missionary societies.
Wow, that's great.
We have gone from, and you heard that report that at the 1880 General Conference, when they came back, that they reported the 1884 General Conference, they reported $464.24. We now have a budget that is $2,580,940. A phenomenal growth, from that very, very small idea. We talked about expanding overseas. We now have 33 field workers who carry on the work over there. We started off with the 4 officers that were elected. There were 22 vice presidents that represented the 22 annual conferences then that were in the AME Zion Church. And now we've just blossomed. We have an executive board of 23. We have our own office in Charlotte that is run by an executive director. We have our house. We have ministries overseas. You've supported so beautifully the Janie Speaks Hospital, the Atlas I. Porter Vocational Center. We are involved in social justice with voter mobilization. We're doing health ministries. So our ministries have gone beyond raising money for funds for church planting to meeting the needs in all aspects of life. So this idea that began with Mary Talbot Jones is now a major 6-department organization in the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church. All of us who serve as an officer or as a local missionary, we want to say a very special thank you to the men who support the Women's Home and Overseas Missionary Society. You heard the challenge that Mary Talbot Jones had, that the men would not support them in 1880.
That's right.
But look at us now. The men are our honorary members. And men, we thank you for your support. You help us to be the society that we are. So as we move forward, we are recommitting ourselves to our motto, and that is to win the world for Christ and to always carry out the Great Commission. I want to say thank you again, John Wesley, for inviting us to look into Mary Talbot Jones, our inspiration and our motivator for keeping the Women's Home and Overseas Missionary Society a strong organization.
Thank you so much, so much.
Amen. Mother Kennard, would you wrap us up for today, please?
Well, DK, are you going to show the video or have you changed that?
Yeah, we're just asking to wrap up right now. It's been a wonderful event thus far. We'll leave on this note.
Okay. On behalf of the parent body of the John Wesley AME Zion Church, Linda Roseman Pettaway, President, I'd like to thank each and every one of you for participating and being with us tonight. We've had a wonderful time and we look forward to seeing you one day very soon. May God bless you and the members of all of your families. Amen.
Amen.